Hello. In this video, I want to talk about projects non-code artifacts or projects non-tech artifacts, we can also call it. And the main idea is to give some understanding of what usually a software engineering project consists of. For example, mainly when we say code base or engineering project, our main concern is actually code that we write. But when we run applications, there is also some items like configuration files, documentation, or tests, or even vendor files, which forms this project. The first items that I want to start is code documentation, and for example, wiki pages or Confluence pages. And just as a little remark, by code documentation, I don't mean documentation that we usually have as part of our code base. For example, let's say it can be like comment lines. I don't mean this part. I mean, let me just finish this part. So I don't mean code comments like this, but mostly I mean some README files, or we can go even deeper. It can be some files explaining different parts of the project, different modules, how they work, which modules, for example, they have, and with all the dependencies, etc. In this particular example, I keep it as a MD file, markdown file as a part of the project. But it can also be, for example, in case of this project, it can be also a wiki page. So GitHub provides this feature, so you can have a wiki page as part of your repository, which is also a separate sub-repository. And then you can have all this documentation. This is also markdown files, but they are rendered as wiki pages. Some people also use Confluence. This is also good for keeping documentation. Or as I showed already, it can be part of the project itself. Part of the, by project I mean part of the main repository itself. It can live in docs folder, and then be part of the project as a documentation. So, and one of the advantages, just another remark, having these files. First of all, it's good for us. For example, in my case, I started taking these notes because I noticed that when I am back to the same feature like a week ago, I don't have usually any idea why I had one model or another model, or why I did some kind of stuff. And what I made for myself is that whenever I have another code change, I make sure that also documentation explaining this code also changed, so it's always up to date. This is good practice. You don't have to do it, but it's good to have. And another example that this can help when you have another person, another developer working with the same code base, it's good also for them. So they can see, they can read some, not only code, but also documentation to understand what's going on. And some people might say that if you have well written code, you don't need documentation. But again, I'm not talking about documentation of each line or each function, but I'm talking about documentation. In this case, I'm talking about documentation of some feature or some algorithm, for example, and etc. etc. So let's move on. Next item in our list is tests. And again, I need to make a remark, because in this case, I'm not talking about the test, like for example this, which is in my case is unit test. I'm talking about this file here, but mainly end-to-end tests. For example, tests that lives not as part of your main or primary code base, but somewhere else. And main goal of this test is to make sure that when, if I say end-to-end test, it means that, for example, they make sure that they start a new instance of your application, provide some inputs, and then check if all the outputs are correct. So it's kind of automation of some manual tests. And usually this kind of tests, they end up being some automation scripts, or again, some documentation pages explaining the whole process or whole use cases. Usually in the projects, we don't, like if we talk about end-to-end tests, we don't test all the features, but we usually test from user perspective, like some user-facing features. And usually they also leave as a separate configuration, separate automated scripts or testing scripts, which at the end also forms the final project. So to me, it's also part of the like project. And to not confuse anyone, for some projects it can be also like integration or maybe component tests. I don't want to go deeper in this topic, like what's the difference between them. But main idea is to have something that automates the process, and then you keep also these files, configurations, or scripts, whatever it is, in your project. So they are part of the project. Another files that we also usually have in our code base, it's a vendor files. For some languages, you don't have them as part of the, for example, Git repository, but whenever you run this project in your local machine or in your CI/CD pipeline, you have to fetch this data, fetch these dependencies, and build up your project. For example, in case of Go, it's our dependent libraries. In case of, for example, Python or Ruby, if you use, for example, web frameworks, it can be files of, for example, Django or files of Ruby on Rails, which is our baseline for our project. And we need those files to build or to execute our final project, so they become our dependencies. So hence they become our code base or part of our project. So that's why I include also this item as part of our artifacts. So we need these files, and usually when we talk about project, we also talk about these files. So one side note that for some languages, they automate this process, so you don't have to track each of these files. There is some automation tools that helps you to fetch this data, fetch these libraries, these files. But anyway, at the end you end up dealing with these files or dealing with these libraries, for example. And the last item, but not least, is our resource files. This is a bit broad topic. It also depends on a language or frameworks that you use. But for example, it can be design images or icons, or if you talk about executable binaries, it can be some embedded files that at the end up being part of your binary, for example. Or simply, it can be also like configuration files. For example, in my example, I have this folder. Let me show you Kubernetes. Let me see. Yeah. So I have this Kubernetes folder where I keep all my configurations for Kubernetes, which is you might say that this is not part of the code base, but this is also artifact. This is also something that I need to execute my project. In one or another way. It can be files for test environment, it can be files of production deployment, but one another way I have it. Another example might be having, for example, Helm scripts. So this is also usually part of our project. Or if you talk about configuration, this can also be, for example, let me show it in GitHub. This can also be, for example, if you use some tools to test your endpoints, for example, like Postman. This can be also Postman collection. So you export it and you keep it in your repository, and other members of your project, they can also use this to run this test, to run this maybe manual tests for themselves. So which my point is, like, this also ends up being part of your project. And then finally, I also include these hacks. I saw it. I'm seeing it like in different projects. But for example, one that I will show you, it's about Kubernetes, and you have this folder called hack. And as they explain, if you go down to README, it clarifies that this is a folder that contains scripts that ensure development of Kubernetes. And then basically, for example, I once tried to do it. if you use like one or another environment, these files can help you to make sure that you have all the dependencies and etc. So, which is also like one of the useful artifact of your project, of your final project. Yeah, I believe that's all items that I wanted to include. Probably if we go more deeper to the topic, there are also some other items that like forms our project. If you have some other items, please let me know that which I missed. And as usual, thanks for watching and see you in another video. Bye bye.